The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
Thank you so much for being here on this St. Patrick's Day. I see a sea of green, so we can check for pinching out there. Not too many. So why focus on spelling at the Fox Reading Conference? Research has shown with abundance and consistency that spelling and reading depend on similar foundational skills, such as the relationship between sounds and letters. And spelling instruction can help students better understand those key foundational skills, which will result in better reading. When planning this conference, we invited our go-to authors and experts on spelling instruction and word study. I'm happy to have our dream team here, and these literacy experts with enthusiasm and passion for words. I'm especially delighted to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Marcia Henry joins us with 58 years of experience working with language acquisition and dyslexia. She's served as a tutor, teacher, clinician, and professor. Dr. Henry provides teacher training related to reading and language arts, and she consults with school districts and states on informed reading instruction. Dr. Henry is the author of Words, Integrated Spelling and Decoding Instruction Based on Word Origin and Word Structure, as well as Unlocking Literacy, Effective Decoding and Spelling Instruction. She's also primary author of the resource, Patterns for Success in Reading and Spelling. She's a fellow in the Academy of Orton-Gillingham Practitioners and Educators. She's a past president of the International Dyslexia Association, and she received the Margaret Bird Rawson Lifetime Achievement Award from IDA in 2000. She joins us from her hometown of Rochester, Minnesota, where she currently serves on the Reading Center Board of Directors. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Henry.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Mrs. Fox and the Fox Endowment for sponsoring this meeting. When I found out that there was no cost for this symposium, I was amazed. I think it just provides such a wonderful opportunity for Tennessee teachers and maybe anybody from out of Tennessee, other than Elsa and Suzanne and me. Okay, well, anyway, it's great to be here, and we'll just hope the clickers all work. What we're going to do this morning, I'm going to spend the whole morning with you, and at first what I'm going to do is just provide a pictorial history of the history of words and the structure of words, because this symposium is focusing on spelling. And so the spell of words is just an intriguing kind of a spell to me. So many of our kids, even good readers, are poor spellers. And why might that be? And part of it is in the history of our words, the type of words that we in America use from the broader English language. So that's what we'll focus on this first hour. And then we'll get down to the real meat of it, the instruction, the intervention, after we have a break. Writing started years and years and years ago. We have our cave paintings, we have our logographic writing, we have our hieroglyphics and our Chinese logographs, which represent 40,000 words. And then we have our phonetic spelling that came along later with our syllabaries and alphabetic system. Some of you may be familiar with these old French Lascaux cave paintings, and they were 17,000 years BCE. That means before Common Era. That's now the way of counting instead of just BC. And most of these cave paintings represented black bulls and horses and stags. And they were discovered quite recently, 1940, by an 18-year-old Frenchman. And over 1,200 visitors came to these caves for years, and that badly contaminated the caves. It deteriorated the artwork, so it was closed to all but scientists in 1968. So unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get there. Then another disaster. They discovered black lung disease within the caves. And so now only one person for 20 minutes a month is allowed to go in and check the climate settings. So they're not even using these for research anymore. But there are other old cave paintings, some as many as up to 100,000 years ago, that have been found in South Africa. So these cave paintings went back many, many years. And of course, what's difficult about those is that we don't know exactly what they represented. Were these religious types of paintings? Was this agricultural? Was it what activities that people like to do? So it's very difficult to infer what they were used for. I just found this cartoon recently. Pictographs, or it didn't happen, it says. And these pictographs told stories and communicated ideas. And otherwise, people couldn't know that it happened if there wasn't this type of register. Here's an Egyptian wall panel. It was found in a tomb. You can see the beautiful drawings. Some are symbols, some are people. And again, we're not quite sure what all of those stood for. In the early 1956, Orton Gillingham Manual, the Gillingham-Stillman Manual, some of you may be familiar with, Anna Gillingham and Bessie Stillman included this picture of various pictographs. Now, I know you can't read that, but the first one up there on top says seated man, man with hand to mouth, man sitting on heel, man with arms raised. Well, you'd have to have a picture for every phrase, so it would be terribly time-consuming. You'd also have to have some artistic ability to do some of these drawings. I would not be able to do that at all. I had the opportunity to teach in Norway for 6 months, and one of my Norwegian students from the University of Trondheim brought this stone drawing, of which Norway has many. And this was probably from about 1000 BCE. And I used to live on an island after my husband and I retired from California. We lived on an island in Lake Superior in northern Wisconsin. And so I was working with some kids with reading difficulties, and I brought this picture. And I said, now, do you recognize anything in there? And one little boy said, well, there's a Viking ship. And they looked at all of the drawings. And one said, well, there's a dog sled. That top looks just like a dog sled looks like. And then one little boy said, well, and look at all the lawnmowers. And I loved that because I doubt if there were lawnmowers, but obviously those things with wheels had some role, and I'm not sure what that would be. Here's another beautiful bowl. from about 600 to 500 BCE. And just with all the drawings and the Greek figures and some of the Greek alphabet in there. So we're starting to see all of these symbols being joined with the pictographs. Here is a Native American teepee cover with drawings on the teepee. And we don't really know if what those symbols below stand for. Is it the number of men and women in the tribe? Is it something they caught? But we see the teepee and the horses and so on. Here are some Chinese ideograms or logograms, they're called both. And these symbols represent not only phonology, but morphology. And it's quite intriguing to see how the two mesh in these Chinese ideograms. When I taught at San Jose State, my office mate, Jimei Chang, is a Chinese woman. And I asked her how many of these ideograms, of these logographs, would a teacher need to know? And she said, oh, at least 5,000 to 7,000. And a doctor would even need to know even more. And when you think of our alphabetic system, how many letters, how many figures do we need to know? Just 26. So it kind of simplifies, I think, the symbols that we use in an alphabetic system. Much of the early writing came from monks, from who were the early scribes. And they wrote laboriously in Latin and later in English. And so the history of English becomes a fascinating study of our alphabetic system and the words that entered English throughout more than 2,000 years. Now, I love this quote. English is a dynamic, constantly changing language with numerous historical forces shaping its development. And this quote comes from John Nist, and I have a reference for that later. This is a wonderful, it's called a cartoon, but it's a wonderful illustration by the very famous illustrator Edward Sorel. And I wanted to use, excuse me, I wanted to use this drawing in my Unlocking Literacy book. And so I just Googled Edward Sorel, and sure enough, there was an address, and I wrote him. And he said, I'd love to have that be in your book, but I don't have the original. And you'd have to have the original to get the clarity. And so naively, I said, well, could you draw another one? And he said, you couldn't afford me, which I couldn't. So we're stuck with this one. But it's a wonderful drawing, I think, showing the prehistoric Celts who came in and fought the Romans, and then the original Romans. And the only Latin existing now from that period are words that have the root castra, C-A-S-T-R, or caster, meaning camp. So Lancaster, Winchester, these place names in Britain are among the very few Latin phrases from that time. And then we have the Anglo-Saxons coming in, and then the Norman Conquest, and then the church and the Renaissance, and all of these things as these different invasions. Unfortunately, they all had battles and wars, that are still going on, of course, today. And, but new words were coined, new words were brought to Britain. And so I love this, this drawing. Now, giving you kind of a timeline, it's important to recognize that when we say the Angles and Saxons and Jutes invaded, that wasn't just one language. There was a whole range of spoken varieties. They came from the Germanic language, but there was no pure Germanic dialect. So we got a lot of the new words coming in at about 450. We used to say AD, now we say CE, meaning Common Era. And this is the publishers forced this change. Here you can see where the Angles and Jutes and Saxons were located, along primarily that area of Germany, and they came in about the 5th century and brought their language to England. Now, the Old English is the English that is such a problem for our kids. The words that we still have from Old English are those words that can be highly irregular. Those are those words that have O-U-G-H, which, as you may know, can say 9 different things. It says O in though, and oo in through, and uff in rough, and so on. And kids just throw up their hands at this. So these are the words that are coming from the Old English. And you'll see there that the Danes, the Norsemen came in. The Old English reached its literary peak with Beowulf. Then the Danes came in, but the Anglo-Saxons continued to dominate. And the end of the Old English period was when William the Conqueror came in with the Norman conquest, and we brought in all sorts of words from the French, and that's when our French Latin words entered the language. Now, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a thought about Old English spelling. That first word, C-N-I-H-T, was how knight, the knight in shining armor, was spelled. And notice in modern English, the word knight includes 3 silent letters. C-N-I-F was knife. And interesting, the Norwegian language, the word knife is spelled K-N-I-V, and it's pronounced kniv. They still pronounce the K. We've made that a silent letter. Here's some other contrasts. The Old English for stone, home, and needle. Feed, ride, and good. Feeden, rijden, good. Hus, nu, heiden, njed, hjern, hjop, and so on for those words. But there's certainly some similarity, but it's become a much, we understand the modern English. It's hard to decipher if you're trying to read something in Old English. Here's Alfred the Great. He was the king of Wessex, and he dealt with the Viking invasions, and he proposed that primary education should be taught in English, not Latin. So that was his big contribution. Now, of course, there wasn't mandatory education in those days. We didn't have a lot of schools. But on the other hand, he said, this is how children and adults need to be educated. In the English, not in the Latin. Here's Beowulf, that was produced around 975, between 975 and 1025. And the author was an anonymous Anglo-Saxon poet. But if you can read some of those words, it would take quite a bit of trying to figure out what exactly those words were saying. Here's William the Conqueror, who came in 1066, and the Norman French became the official language of state, and while English was the language of the people. So more and more people were speaking English, but the government type of organizations were using the Norman French, which was Latinate in its base. Now we come to Middle English. Between 1150 and 1500, English becomes the official language of state when Edward III becomes king. Geoffrey Chaucer dies, leaving his Canterbury Tales. King Henry writes in Middle English. English borrows from Latin and Greek during the Renaissance. That's where when most of the Latinate words and Greek-based words that we use today so frequently in our content textbooks as well as literature came in about 1475. And William Caxton begins printing in English. Here we have the Canterbury Tales. A good friend of mine illustrated many of these drawings, and so I give special thanks to Sally Parsons, my good friend, and she's an amazing illustrator. Geoffrey Chaucer, considered the father of English literature, and he legitimized the literary use of Middle English vernacular. And of course, Canterbury Tales is what he is known mostly for. Now, the printing press was an amazing invention. Remember that I said most of the writing came from the monks, from the scribes. And Johannes Gutenberg spent 20 years building his first printing press. And, but that was in Latin. That was not in English. It took 3 years once he had completed the printing press. It took 3 years to complete the translation of the Gutenberg Bible. And it had a run of approximately 200 copies. It's estimated that 49 still exist. So, but no complete copies have been sold since 1978. Just a bit of trivia there. Here's William Caxton. He printed the Recall of the Histories of Troy in English in 1476. And it was a French courtly, it was described as a French courtly romance. And this was the beginning of the standardization of English spelling. Before that, we had many different ways. I think it's in Diana King's little book, English Isn't Crazy. She says that the word friend had about 4 or 5 different spellings from the Old English and as the scribes transcribed the word. But then it became the friend after the time of William Caxton. Because once it was printed, it kind of became the standard. There were still many changes after that, but that was kind of what happened. Now we get to modern English, 1600 to the present. That's quite a span of 400 some years. Queen Elizabeth and William Shakespeare wrote in English. Samuel Johnson compiled the first comprehensive dictionary of English. And then about 75 years later, Noah Webster compiled the first American English dictionary. And then it took about 75 years to write the Oxford English Dictionary, which was finally completed in 1928. The third version, the third edition, has just came out last year, and it's online. And some of you may have access to it. If you live in a large city, most public libraries own them. If you wanted to buy your own copy of the online edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, it's almost $1,000. So if you want to look at one, you might try your library. Here we have Shakespeare, the Bard of Avon, and Queen Elizabeth I was known as his queen, and he was writing during what we call the Elizabethan age. And as you know, Shakespeare wrote comedies, he wrote tragedies, he coined many new words and expressions. Here are just a few of his expressions. A killing frost, my kingdom for a horse, in the mind's eye, white as driven snow, a pound of flesh, truth will out, and a fool's paradise. In addition, from about 1601 to 1616, the St. James Version of the Bible was translated into English. This was the first translation of the Bible. And that was considered one of the most important books in English. So it all took part during this same time period. Samuel Johnson was considered the most distinguished man of letters in England, and he published his Dictionary of the English Language in 1755. I thought we should add some of the Americans who contributed a lot to our language. Thomas Jefferson, was of course the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, and he endorsed the use of new words and the expansion of American English. And he was the first to talk about the many dialects that were found in America. And I'm doing some work in Arkansas this year and last year. And I just love the different accents, the different dialects that I hear. The same with Tennessee. I was reading about Tennessee language, and Tennessee is one of the states with the most diversity in dialects in the whole country. I'm a Minnesotan, and we think we have the pure language. and we all speak the same. Well, I'm not sure that's true, but it's quite interesting. Commentators on the major networks might often want to support a Southerner, a deep Southerner, but their dialect is usually so foreign to most Americans that they often send these people to Milwaukee and Minneapolis and Chicago, because those are considered a more standard English. I don't know if that's the case, but just listen to the people on the national news. They all speak more like I do than people with an accent from the South. Your local news people will probably speak more like you do. In a letter to John Waldo in 1813, Jefferson expressed his concern that many in England thought that as the English language, writers of the United States will adulterate it. He then affirms the importance of language change. Certainly, so great growing a population spread over such an extent of country with such a variety of climates, of productions, of arts, must enlarge their language to make it answer its purpose of expressing all ideas, the new as well as the old. The new circumstances under which we are placed call for new words, new phrases, and for the transfer of old words to new objects. And this is why we have one of the biggest problems for children with vocabulary are our use of the same word for multiple purposes. I remember hearing Suzanne at a conference, and you talked about trunk, the word trunk. And she had everybody in the audience think of what trunk means to them. Well, hardly anybody thought of bathing trunks. But everybody knew the trunk of a car or the trunk of an elephant or the luggage trunk. But it's fascinating. And this is very difficult, especially for our second language learners. Because of I was looking up the word bank the other day, and there are about 8 or 9 different meanings of bank. The cliff, the bank you do your money work in, and so on. And so we've expanded words, and just like Jefferson proposed, we're using old words for new ideas. Here we have one of the first spellers, and this was the Horn Book. And the Horn Book were very popular for copying, for reading. Usually the copying that was done was religious in nature, and children would, copy from the Bible or from a religious poem or here's our Father which art in heaven on this little Horn Book here. Now, Daniel Webster was an American politician, a very powerful orator, and a courtroom lawyer. And he was a master of formal English. And he tended to speak much more like formal English rather than American English. Noah Webster was an American lexicographer, that's a dictionary maker. Lex meaning words, and graph meaning to print. And he was a spelling reformer. And he published the American Dictionary of the English Language. One of his great proponents was President Theodore Roosevelt. And Webster wrote one of the first spelling books in America. It was called the Blue-Backed Speller Books. And I guess the books must have had a blue cover. And the dictionary that he wrote was bought by Merriam, and it's now called the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. I know all of you have heard of that. Here's a cover from his American spelling book in 1824. Now, we had lots of writers in this period who again brought in more and more modern English words, but American words. Writers of this area like Mark Twain, Walt Whitman, Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville, hadn't even been born in 1800, so they didn't come along until later. And David Crystal, the very great British linguist, said, American literature, when it eventually emerged, did not begin to be studied in U.S. schools until the 20th century. And if you're interested in more history about English words and American words. Read his book called The Stories of English. One of the main findings or bringings into the language that Twain was he represented Black English. He wrote as if he were speaking Black English in many of his books. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, one of the few famous women writers of the time, did the same. Now, Theodore Roosevelt was kind of a character, and he endorsed the Spelling Reform Board founded by Andrew Carnegie. And in what he proposed was that mist would be, like I missed the boat, mist would be spelled M-I-S-T, and caressed would be C-A-R-E-S-T, and mold would be mold. Now, the board suggested the respelling of 300 words, many of them formally ending in ed, to be ended in t. Other changes which actually came about was to include the removal of silent letters. So catalog, which in English words, British words, ends in G-U-E, would just end in G. We accept both spellings, of course. Caliber, the other change he made was taking words ending in R-E and changing them to E-R. So caliber, which ended in British English, ends in R-E, would end in E-R. Saber, S-A-B-R-E, would end in E-R. He thought it would be a great idea to have O-U-G-H just changed to an O to represent the long vowel sound, as in though and although. And many of us do that, don't we? If we're writing informally, we spell though, T-H-O, but we know what the real spelling is. He also thought that any time an S said Z, as in rose, brazen, surprise, the S should be changed to a Z because you're hearing Z. He was trying to make English a more perfect phonetic language. Digraphs would be eliminated, with the board promoting such spelling as anemia, anesthesia, archaeology, encyclopedia, and orthopedic, which in the British form have AE. And that change was made. So, but this ending the ED in a T was totally unacceptable to scholars and to printers. And a very cute cartoon came up. Kicked out, K-I-K-T. So we know what happened to his idea on that. So now here's just a kind of a summary of the history of the language from the early Celt migrations, the Roman occupation, the Germanic settlements, that's the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, the Viking invasions, which brought in the Old Norse words, the Norman invasion, the Anglo-Norman and Old French, then the Renaissance. So you can see how this fits so nicely with that Edward Sorel illustration of all those battles that went on. And we here again is just another way of thinking of Old English, Middle English, early modern English, and later, late modern English. Now, we know that words continue to form. American English just loves to soak in new words. And the westward movement, Tennessee was such a big part of this movement to the west. And words that came out at that time, cantankerous, caboodle, rambunctious. Food words, we're still bringing in new food words. Now we have a lot from Thailand, in Minnesota, Rochester is where I live. And we have several excellent Thai restaurants, which 10, 20 years ago didn't exist. And so we're learning new words for foods. Technology continues to expand. Bandwidth, video cassette, microbyte, astronaut, virtual reality, artificial intelligence. All of these terms are recent. What has spurred on much of this technology, the new words in technology? It's the internet, isn't it? We have words such as baby boomer, or phrases, words and phrases, couch potato, awesome, hunk, channeling, airhead, Google, tweets, and so on. It's kind of fun to look at. Every year, the American Dialect Society has a word of the year. Just look at the words for the last about 9 or 10 years. In 2009, tweet. 2010, Google. And that's Google without a capital G. It means let's Google it. If you want to look if you need to look something out, well, Google it. App, hashtag, because, to introduce a part of speech. I've never heard this, because tired. The phrase with the hashtag Black Lives Matter. 2015, they as a general, neutral, singular pronoun. It's to get away from he, she. Just use they. Dumpster fire. It's defined as an exceedingly disastrous or chaotic situation. The term dumpster fire was selected as best representing the public discourse and preoccupations of 2016. Guess what 2017 was? Fake news. I don't know what 2018 will bring, but it would be interesting to think about that. English is a polyglot. Now think about the meaning of polyglot. Everybody probably knows what poly means. What does it mean? Many. Anybody know glot? Yeah, several of you are going here to the epiglottis, to the throat. It's used as many tongues. A polyglot means many tongues. And this is a fabulous book by Robert Claiborne called Our Marvelous Native Tongue, The Life and Times of the English Language. And he says, the truth is that if borrowing foreign words could destroy a language, English would be dead from Old Norse, deceased from French, defunct from Latin, and kaput from German. When it comes to borrowing, English excels from Latin, surpasses from French, and eclipses from Greek any other tongue, past or present. And I think that's just a marvelous way of thinking about our language and how we're just bringing in more and more words. How many words are there in English? Do you know what estimates are now? Over 1 million words. English has by far the most words of any language. We have words to describe almost everything. Now, there are some other languages that go more into depth in words. For instance, in Alaska natives have over 20 words to describe snow, the different consistencies of snow. And we would probably just say it's snow, it's snowing. It's a blizzard, it's deep snow, it's heavy snow, but we keep using snow. They have different words, so they go more into depth than perhaps English does. But we have so many words. We couldn't possibly learn the meanings of all those 1 million words unless we had some other strategies. that we could use. And that's what we're going to be talking about after our break. This was by E.B. White, the author of Charlotte's Web. He said, "The living language is like a cow path. It is the creation of the cows themselves, who, having created it, follow it or depart from it according to their whims or their needs. From daily use, the path undergoes change. A cow is under no obligation to stay." And we just go along that path and we pull in new words. We discard the ones that we don't want to use any longer. Now, let me tie this to what we'll talk about after our break. I wanted to thank illustrator Sally Parsons for her drawings. And then here's my contact information if you would like that. Now, what I'd like to do in the last few minutes we have is kind of foreshadow the next presentation as we talk about the structure of the language. Primarily what I've done is walked you through how the words came about in these different periods. But now let's actually look at these layers of language. Now, because they're usually short words, the words we teach first are generally these Anglo-Saxon, often called Old English words. Both terms are used interchangeably. Most are common, short, everyday, down-to-earth words. They're the words that we find in our primers: run, go, jump, live, life, happy, sad, and up, down, etc. But they're also among the most difficult words to learn because they can include those non-phonetic words or irregular words, they're often called. So these may be the ones that we realize first what trouble our kids are having in acquiring that basic sight vocabulary. Now, the Romance level of the language, the Latin-based level, contains more, I'll say, sophisticated words, used primarily in more formal settings, such as literature and textbooks. What are the 5 Romance languages that come to us from the Latin? Somebody name one? French. What else? Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and what's the 5th? The clue is in the name Romance. Romanian is the 5th Romance language. Now, interesting, there are only about 10 to 15% of the words in English come from the Anglo-Saxon Old English. Over 55% of our words come from the Latin. And almost all of those words are affixed. What is an affix? It's a prefix or a suffix, isn't it? And what happens, and we'll get more into this, but what we do is we take a nice, strong Latin base or root, like rupt. I have disrupt, bankrupt, erupt, eruption, abrupt, abruptly, interruption, interrupting, interrupted. So I expand those Latin roots by adding prefixes and suffixes. This is the thing that I find missing in almost all school textbooks. If they if they provide any Latin word roots, it might be 3 or 4. And yet, over 55% of our words come from that layer. The Greek, we have about 10 to 12%, which are Greek-based words, and those are the specialized words used mostly in math and science, photograph, archaeology, and so on. Now, I'm often asked, how would you teach this? When would you teach this? And actually, I have a different slide, I think, the second time. I've moved all of this back a little. We have new research from Susan Ebers, from John Kirby, and Pete Bowers out of Queen's University in Canada, that even first and second graders have to know some of those inflected endings, the ER, the plural S, the past tense ED, the prefixes like re and pre and so on, dis and miss, because we find those in their readers. My dream world, though, would have kindergarten spending a lot more time on phonemic awareness and wordplay, having fun with words, not, laboriously going through flashcards and, it makes no sense. And I almost think, if you look at some of the work of Isabel Liberman and her colleagues at Haskins Lab and University of Connecticut, they found that for phonemic awareness, many of the phonemic awareness skills, especially the deletion, like if I say blimp without the O, or say blimp without the blip. It's not until 6 or 7 even that kids really get that. So we're asking kids to memorize a lot of words in kindergarten. They'd be much better off with lots of wordplay, rhyming, this kind of thing. Then by first grade, second grade, they have to learn their ABCs and corresponding sounds. We know that letter naming is important. Their Anglo-Saxon consonants and vowel patterns. I'd move compound words and prefixes and suffixes and syllable patterns down towards second grade. Latin word roots we need to start in about 3rd grade and 4th grade. And I'll show you why after the break. I'll show you some lists of words from 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade textbooks. And you'll be amazed. To me, they look like high school words. So we've got to start providing some of this morphology. The morphemes are the meaning units. We'll get more into that. This is the framework that I designed for my dissertation. And it took me a long time to kind of figure this out. I had been teaching for 22 years before I started my doctoral program. And I knew a lot about letter-sound correspondences and syllable patterns and morpheme patterns, those prefixes and suffixes and roots, as strategies for kids to decode and spell. I knew nothing about the different languages, the origins that made such a difference. And so what I thought would be a complete framework or curriculum and instruction would be to teach all 9 of these cells to kids. And that's what we're going to do quickly in an hour or so after the break. But what happens in schools is because now we're saying we need to teach everything we need by 3rd grade, right? I mean, that's when phonic, everything should stop. And then first we learn to read and then we read to learn. And that's fine. But we know that many kids at 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th aren't reading at grade level. And those are the kids we're concerned about. In most curricula, take Macmillan, take Harcourt Brace, take any of those major reading series, the only cell that gets much attention is that top one on the left, the Anglo-Saxon letter sound patterns. I think most schools are starting to incorporate phonics. That's our phonics cell. Some get into syllable patterns. Hardly any get into morphemes except a handful, maybe 3 or 4 prefixes and 3 or 4 suffixes. Tell me I'm wrong. You know, if you find a series you really like that has all of this in it, I would love that. But they rarely touch at the Latin and Greek and their contributions. And so that's what we're going to concentrate on after our break. That's all I have until we break. Thank you.